Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the February 25th, 2025 meeting of the City Finance Committee. Can I get a roll call, please?
Yes, we'll start with Committee Member Santa Maria,
Here.
Committee Member Harmon,
Here.
Chair Friedman.
Here. All right, first I will open it up for general public comment. Are there any members of the public, actually I do have one, that wish to speak generally to items under the purview of the Finance Committee, but not on today's agenda? And I have Audrey Liggett. If you want to come up to the microphone over there, and you'll have 3 minutes.
Cool. Hi. I might be barking up the wrong tree here, so a couple things. One, apologies for that. Two, I didn't come prepared with actual notes, but I'm here just to talk again about the city's loan rehab program. It is a burning dumpster fire. I have no financial interest in the outcomes of the program, but there are some changes that need to happen. I'm an ex-JP Morgan hedge fund manager and have a deep, deep experience in finance. And the runaround that I got from the housing agency and the running I got, pardon me, Madam Attorney, but from your office as well, is nuts. It's just, it's out of control. There are people who don't know the basic fundamentals of how things are supposed to work. The city is not following basic standard procedures of industry practice, and they're just simple changes that need to be made. So you're going to hear me again at 2 o'clock. Again, apologies for that. But having a conversation not just with the city attorney's office and not just with housing, but with the actual families that are significantly impacted by this is where you're going to get a lot of vital information. Again, I have nothing to do with it at this point other than to keep bringing the attention to council and now finance committee about what's happening because it is wrong. While the city attorney's office maintains their legal prerogative of what is occurring, I think we can all think of historical examples, well, to a lesser degree, of things that might be legal but are still wrong. And in this case, the way the city is approaching handling these loans, and again, the threats of foreclosure coming from the housing agency, the insistence that families have to sell their homes, this is happening. And anything different coming from the housing agency or coming from the city's attorney's office would be inaccurate. So again, if the city believes in having a housing crisis, or rather that we have one, that families, first generation homeowners, et cetera, deserve a chance. This is an easy area where we can make an adjustments. And if this happened to someone like me, not to pat myself on the shoulder, but someone who knows finance, I can only imagine what's happening to families who might have English as their second language, who might not know the different points of the city and whom to speak with. So anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Liggett. Being it's general public comment, we're not able to respond. So with that, is there anyone online who wishes to speak to general public comment?
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised.
All right, I will close general public comment and now move on to our item for the day, which is the fiscal year 2025 second quarter review, and I will turn it over to our finance director, Ms. DiMartini.
Thank you very much, Chair Freeman. Good afternoon, members of the Finance Committee. My name is Keith DiMartini. I'm the city's finance director. I'm here with Ms. Natalie Licoli, the city's controller, and it's our pleasure to provide an overview of the second quarter financial review for fiscal year 2025. The recommendation before the Finance Committee today is listed on this slide. Just in short, to receive a summary of the revenues and expenditures for the first half of the current fiscal year, receive the interim financial statements for that same time period. There are two resolutions that are before the City Council this afternoon for adoption on the consent calendar. The first one is to have the Finance Committee recommend approval to the City Council later today to approve of the Q2 budget adjustments, and then also a recommendation to have Council approve a resolution for an amendment to the city's position salary control resolution for authorized positions. The agenda for today's presentation is as follows. We'll go into a little bit of detail about the general fund first, and then Ms. Licoli will talk about the enterprise funds. We'll talk about those proposed budget adjustments that are before council later today for approval, as well as a handful of position changes, and then take your questions, open it up for public comment and discussion. So first, let's talk about the city's general fund. And before I jump in, let me first also talk about the Q2 projection process in general. This is the city's most robust process for reviewing the financial outlook for the current fiscal year is during the Q2 review. This is when staff have 6 months worth of actual data of revenue and expenditures, and we go through a really robust process to project out where we think we will end up on all of our revenues and expenditures so that we can provide a really thoughtful and up-to-date picture to the city council of where we think we will end up. And so that is what we are presenting today. And what we will first do and what we will do going forward is provide an update on our general fund multi-year forecast. And this is a graph that I'm sure is familiar to all of you. It shows our projected expenditures in the red line and our revenues in the green line going forward out 5 years. We do not just look 1 year at a time. This is the basis for our budget process going forward. And it does show, again, continued structural imbalance where our revenues are growing but not at the same rate as our expenditures. And so this is important to know as sort of context and a backdrop for this conversation going forward. Looking at that graph and converting it into actual numbers, this is a summary table of our multi-year forecast general fund revenues and our expenditures. One thing that's really important to note here is that in the expenditure line, we are also including an assumption for the annual contribution to our reserves. And what I mean by that is our reserve policy dictates that 25% of our annual operating budget needs to be held in reserve for disaster and contingency. When our expenditure budget grows, like it does every year, the amount of money we need to keep in reserve actually grows proportionately. And so that expenditure line includes an assumption there. And when you take all that into account, you will see that we have had operating deficits for the last couple of years, and we are projected to do so again in fiscal year 2025. You'll see that fiscal year 2026, it turns around. That's incorporating the full annual amount of the new sales tax measure that the voters approved back in November for Measure I. But then again, you can see that we quickly turn into a sort of a really small deficit going forward. The 2 financial plan years are our baseline assumptions for those 2 fiscal years. Staff is currently working very hard to develop our budget proposals for both fiscal years right now with the city administrator's office. And the city administrator will present her budget to the full city council on April 22nd, where that will be fully updated and communicated at that time. This slide here shows the summary pie charts for our revenues and our expenditures in the general fund. No major takeaways on this other than we have a pretty diverse set of revenue streams in the general fund, which is great. We are not solely reliant on 1 or 2 revenue sources. And on the expenditure side, coming no surprise, the vast majority of our general fund tax dollars pays for staff to deliver those essential services to the community. This is a similar view of the same graph where it just shows in a column view all of our major tax revenues on the left-hand side, the budget in the dark green color, and in the dark blue color our projection. And as you can see, our projections are coming in pretty closely to where we originally budgeted. There is some variation, which I will speak about in a later slide. And now looking at just fiscal year 25, focusing on this current fiscal year, this table here shows our general fund revenues and expenditures and where we project to end up at the end of the fiscal year. And compared to our budget, our revenues and expenditures are coming in pretty close. So we had budgeted a deficit of about $9.9 million. Again, that's after an assumption of that contribution to reserves of $3.2 million. And our projection is coming in a little bit better, where we're projecting an overall deficit in the general fund of $7.2 million. On Measure C, you can see a similar trend where we had projected a deficit, where we appropriated a few extra projects in Measure C revenues in fiscal year 25, and our sales tax revenues are coming in pretty light. They're coming in below our projections, our original budget for Measure C sales tax, which will result in a little bit of an increased deficit projection there. So this table I want to spend a little bit of time on is the summary of our major tax revenues in the general fund. And what this table shows is our adopted budget for all of these tax revenues, what our revised budget is, and then how much money has come in to date through the end of December 31st, 2024, and then what our projection is for the end of the fiscal year. And I'll just highlight a couple notable items here. First, property tax, our largest single general fund revenue source. We project that it's going to come in pretty much at budget, around $51 million. The data suggests that it will come in right around budget. Sales tax, on the other hand, we are projecting to come in lower. So you can see that both in sales tax and in Measure C sales tax. Sales tax generally has been flat quarter over the past 6 quarters. We are not seeing any significant growth in any of our sales tax projections that we are receiving, so we are projecting it to come in a little bit lower. Transient occupancy tax, on the other hand, we are projecting to come in a little bit higher. It's been a little bit more positive over the first 6 months of the fiscal year compared to last 6 months around the same time. There is seasonality in our TOT, which we take into consideration. And so those are some notable trends that I wanted the Finance Committee to be aware of. We will, of course, monitor this as the fiscal year continues and adjust accordingly going forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Licoli, who's going to talk about, I'll skip this slide, who's going to talk about short-term rental and other components of the projection.
Good afternoon, Chair Freeman and Committee Member Armon and Santa Maria. The short-term rental program, it has been now in place for almost a year. At the 6-month mark of this new fiscal year, 36 settlements took place, or an additional $904,000 posted to the general fund. $165,000 is allocated to Measure B for the creek restoration. Now, this slide is a representation of our general fund expenditure for both adopted, revised budget, as well as the result for Q2 and a projection for the full year. The variances between adopted and revised budget are mostly due to encumbrance that were rolled over to fiscal year 25 after adopted budget was approved. Some of these encumbrance, as well as new transactions, are on hold at the end of the second quarter under the column encumbrance. We show on this table percentage used without and with encumbrance in comparison to revised budget. General government is 43% of revised budget. The lower use of budget attributed to salary saving and professional services contract that will be exhausted by the end of the fiscal year. This division project to finish the year within the revised budget. Public safety. The public safety is at 49% of the revised budget and forecast to realign itself with its adopted budget. Police. At the mark of the 6 month, 48% of revised budget is exhausted, and police will end its fiscal year in line with budget. PD's effort to fill a vacant position has reduced its vacancy rate to less than 10%. By doing so, our expenses are now higher, mostly due to the rental of academy apartments. Supply and services are projected to be at 96.3% of revised budget by the end of the year, when motor vehicle expenses have risen in comparison to last year due to repair of several fleet vehicles. The fire department used 50% of its revised budget and planned to have no change in its forecast for fiscal year 25 with revised budget. The department had a successful recruitment with 7 firefighters. In addition, 6 new water rescue members are now certified. Community development. The community development is below its revised budget at 45%. Projection is to reduce its spending by $1 million, realigning itself with adopted budget. Park and recreation is following a normal trend and project to finish the year within revised budget. Change in weather could, however, impact the forecast. That said, the division is doing well at this point. There is a higher demand than expected for the aquatic program. Library. Library is a combination of the administration for Montecito Branch, Central, and East Side Library, as well as the on-the-go library. After a turbulent time between delay in construction project for the Central Library, extensive repair for East Side Library, the operations are back to normal. We will experience some saving due to position vacancy. A partial of it will be offset by a peak in supply and services. At this time, 43% of budget has been exhausted, and the department expects a saving in expense by $1 million for fiscal year 25. Public work. Public work has expenditure of $6.4 million, using 44% of its revised budget. Expenses are predominantly related to engineering services, which are mostly expected to be recovered through billing. The department forecasts to end the fiscal year below the budget with a saving for $600,000. Sustainability and resilience currently has two special projects: emergency remediation and the Lot 12 environmental remediation, for which most of those expenses are driven from. 25% of budget has been used so far, but projection for fiscal year 25 is still to meet the budget. Community development. Community development spends $7.5 million of its budget, with $1.5 million in encumbrance, mainly composed of professional service agreement for plan check services and building inspection. Community development project to end the fiscal year below budget by about $877,000 due to ongoing vacancy, staff turnover, and benefits that may slightly been over budgeted. For this end of second quarter, general fund expenditure is $109 million, or 48% of revised budget. Taking in account the outstanding encumbrance for $6.3 million, it would bring our fiscal year-to-date spending to $116 million, or 51% of revised budget. Note that under non-departmental, adopted and revised budget include an overall citywide cost reduction allocation for $6 million. Projection for general fund expenditure for this fiscal year 25 is $4.3 million lower than revised budget, predominantly attributed to public safety, community development, and library department, as we just discussed. This graph is an overview of the different departments we commented on. Projections are stacked above the actual for a closer comparison with adopted and the revised budget. We will now cover the enterprise fund, starting with the water department. Water department revenue totaled $42.5 million, or 53% of budget, an increase of $2.8 million with fiscal year 24. Service charge received from rates are $37.3 million, 56% of budget. Although rate revenue is tracking above budget, it is below the seasonal target. Rate revenue is projected to end the year 1% below budget. Expenses for the first 6 months are at 43% of budget, mostly due to the desalination plan being offline from August to December. Let's keep in mind that the budget is prepared with the assumption that the plant operates at full capacity. The fiscal year 25 budget was developed during contract negotiation with the desal operator and included several scenarios. Negotiation lasted a year and a half and were a huge success. The agreement came in at the lower end of the scenario, which explained the projected change for expense versus the budget. Result of operation at this point of time is an additional $5.4 million in reserve in comparison to a budgeted loss for $6.6 million. Wastewater account for the provision of sewer services to the residents of the city. A portion of the revenue is directly linked to water usage, when other revenue sources such as sewer tap fees, pre-treatment analysis are as well part of this line item. For the first 6-month mark, wastewater is 52% of its budget, with a projection that will line up with revised budget. Expenses largely dominated by chemical, equipment repair, professional services are 41% of budget and will end the fiscal year as forecasted. After 6 months, the department added $2.3 million to its reserve and project to reduce its deficit by almost $1 million in comparison to budget because of limited capacity to complete projects that are due to the staff shortage. Solid waste account mainly for trash and recycling services. Revenue trend is as expected of 49% of the budget and is projected to increase by $750,000 when expense at a shortfall of 37% of budget is attributed to solid cost collection services. $5.1 million is added to their reserve at Q2. Fiscal year 25 is projected at an additional $1.2 million in reserve due to payroll and non-capital equipment reduction in spending. Then we'll move to clean energy. Clean energy has a loss of $2.5 million at the end of the second quarter, trending with the half-a-year revised budget. The department decided to reduce its revenue and corresponding expense with a Q2 budget adjustment that is reflected at this point in its full-year projection. Southern California Edison implemented a mid-year rate decrease of 12%. As Santa Barbara clean energy rates are benchmarked by Southern California Edison rate by policy, revenue will be down as seen on this slide. Airport came almost at a neutral position at the end of Q2. For the first 6-month mark, there is a 15% increase in passenger rate with last year for the same period. Terminal revenue lead with 53% of budget. Revenue projection will stay with revised budget. Expense currently under budget will experience a peak during the last part of the fiscal year due to unexpected repair at the terminal generator and for other equipment. Projection for this year is a use of reserve by $4.4 million. Waterfront sustained its operation through various revenues such as lease, sleep, and parking fees. At Q2, the department experienced modest revenue growth maintained by parking service and marina management division. Property management experienced a decline in revenue from some key large food service tenants. Spending stayed with the trend, and the department planned to end the year with a use of $800,000 in reserve. The downtown parking. Downtown parking revenue is at $5.6 million, or 36% of its budget, a slight increase with fiscal year 24. Parking revenue are in target, but outdoor business facility rent revenue is significantly under budget at 34%. The division is working with business owners to set up payment plan to help recover the loss in revenue. Projection for fiscal year 25 will consequently experience a shortfall of $3.6 million due to a combination of this line item as well as a change in flow of revenue from the MTC Fiesta 5 Theater. Spending will stay under control. At the 6-month mark, operation result is neutral, with a projected operational decrease in reserve by $3.3 million with revised budget. And the last department, golf. Golf account for the operation of the municipal golf course. Its activity resulted to a $2.5 million in revenue and a 1.9 million in expenses. There's no change in its forecast with the budget. We will now move on to the proposed budget amendment. I listed a couple of them for the general fund and as well for the special revenue fund and enterprise fund. One of them under the general fund is an increase in appropriation in a police station capital fund funded from the revenue bond proceed to help cover the cost to build a new police station, which reflect to an increase in revenue and expenditure. On the side of the enterprise fund, we have a decrease in estimated revenue in downtown parking. On-street paid parking was not approved by council, but included in adopted budget. So there would be a reduction of 2.5 million in revenue requested for the budget adjustment. And Keith?
Thank you so much, Ms. LaCulley. Just to wrap up here, we have a couple of position changes that staff are recommending as part of the quarterly process. A couple that I'll highlight here are a couple of reclassifications, one in the finance department to again realign the required responsibilities of this function within our accounts receivable division, and also in information technology, again, to realign the responsibilities of a network analyst in the department as well. In the staff report, you will see a couple of other very minor position reclassification requests. Again, this is a standard process that we started about a year ago to bring these more technical position reclassifications to the Finance Committee and City Council during these quarterly review processes so that it's not waiting for the annual budget process. So it's we're sort of addressing some of these issues in a more timely fashion. And so with that, that concludes our presentation. We'd be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. I'll open up to questions from my colleagues. Any questions? All right. I have just a couple. The first couple may be related to slide 6. Just wanted to understand, so the fiscal year 26 has the 3.3, and that includes Measure I?
Councilmember Freeman, yes, in fiscal year 25, actually, we're starting our projection for Measure I sales tax because the new sales tax rate will take effect on April 1st of this fiscal year. And so there is 3 months worth of projected Measure I sales tax revenue in the fiscal year 2025 projection. It's included there. And then a full fiscal year will begin in fiscal year 26.
Okay, and then along with that, so in 26, the surplus, if lack of a better word, is 3.3 estimated. But that, just to clarify, that does not take into account the class and comp study that's coming to council later today and the implementation of it over a period of years. Does it include that or not? So would that affect that number, the implementation of it?
Yes, Chair Freeman, thank you so much for that question. It does not at this time. What is included in these numbers is all of the known salary and benefit changes that we are aware of at this time through our labor negotiation process, through MOUs that are currently in place. And then if an MOU expires within the 2-year financial plan period, we include an additional salary increase assumption for what may occur, right? It's a budget assumption. It's not what we're communicating to our bargaining groups. And in fiscal year 2026, that salary increase assumption is 5%. And in fiscal year 2027, that increase assumption is 4%. And that assumption includes all of the changes that may occur for salaries, those that may be negotiated through the table. It also includes step increases that an employee that may be warranted during those years as well. But any additional costs associated with the class income study are not included in these numbers.
So that number is fluid. Some of it may be part of the assumptions, and some of it maybe go and beyond, above and beyond to affect it. And then same type of question, there's been discussion about a contribution to the local housing trust fund. Would that affect the 3.3 million in 26 if there was a contribution as part of the budget that goes towards that?
Chair Friedman, yes, it would. It would affect that. Right now, in these numbers as presented today, there is no assumption of a transfer to the city's local housing trust fund or any other sort of similar service. If council chooses to appropriate that, we would include a transfer out of the general fund and then into the housing trust fund for that, which would be represented as an expenditure in the general fund.
Okay, so if we do that, that would change that number, but.
Correct.
So, okay. And then just two more questions. If you could put slide 9. On Measure C, on the bottom, there's the deficit. That's different because there's no reserve for Measure C. But if there is a deficit, how would we address that? Because the sales tax is coming in less than anticipated. How would we address that?
Yes, Chair Freeman, that's a great question. And so first I'll say that staff does not have any cash flow concerns with Measure C at the moment. It's sort of the nature of how capital projects are appropriated and how they get spent over time, right? We have to let out construction contracts with the full amount of appropriation in advance. And so we have enough cash to be able to kind of see through the ebbs and flow of how Measure C sales tax revenue comes in. It is a concern. It is worth us talking about with the city council about which projects we plan to appropriate for next fiscal year and going forward, because it could potentially impact how many projects we appropriate next fiscal year if we think this sort of softening of our sales tax revenue trends is going to continue.
Okay, and that's a discussion we could have part of the capital improvement program that's going to be coming up in a couple weeks.
Yep, that's correct.
All right, and then slide 19, my last question related to downtown parking. How is the general fund impacted by downtown parking? Are there any backfilling of it or subsidizing? How is the fund itself in terms of revenue in, revenue out? It's quasi-enterprise fund. So is the general fund on the hook for any of that, or do we have any expected pressures from the general fund that we might be looking at?
Chair Friedman, again, just to confirm, we do treat downtown parking as its own enterprise fund. It is a standalone, so it does need to generate adequate revenues, not only to cover its annual operating expenses, but to also invest in its capital infrastructure. And so because the downtown parking enterprise fund is in some distress, right, it doesn't have adequate reserves at this time, and its reserves have continued to decline over the last couple of years, as we've talked about over the last couple of budget cycles. In fiscal year 2025, the City Council did appropriate the use of Measure C revenues to fund a couple of the downtown parking capital projects. And so that is a burden on the city's general fund to pay for those capital projects. Staff is currently working on sort of some proposals about what we plan to propose to the City Council for the upcoming budget cycle. So that information will be forthcoming.
So we are looking at that as a bigger picture that tells the story where we are, but there's more complex than what's up there.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. With that, I will open it to public comments. Not seeing any in the room, I'll go to online. Is there any member of the public that wishes to speak?
Chair Friedman, no hands are raised.
All right, I will close public comment and turn over to my colleagues for comments and a motion. Who'd like to go first? Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I can be very brief. Just want to say how much I continue to appreciate these updates, and the deep dives are extremely helpful, and I think will be particularly useful as we move into April. So very much appreciate this and your continued hard work on behalf of our city. And I'd be happy to make the motion when the time is right.
All right, Member Santa Maria.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Yes, I want to echo what Committee Member Megan Harmon said. Thank you genuinely for this deep dive. I think it's really important, especially as we dive into, the upcoming budget process and taking a look at all of our competing interests in the city. This is gives us a good holistic sense of, where we may or may not have some wiggle room. So I would be happy to second that motion.
All right.
Move staff recommendation.
Okay. A motion's been made, it's been seconded. I will just add, I appreciate all the work in this. The second quarter is one of the most important times because it gives us that half-a-year data. And then with Measure I coming in as part of the budget for, it's actually going to be part of this year's budget, but the full for the next 2-year budget cycle, this gives us a good representation of where the starting point is, so it's important on this. And so with that, the motion has been made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Abstentions? Passes unanimously. With that, we are adjourned.